Dr. William Banks is a Syracuse University College of Law Board of Advisors Distinguished Professor and Emeritus Professor at the College of Law and the Maxwell School as Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs. In addition, Dr. Banks is the founding director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism at Syracuse University. Dr. Banks is the co-author to leading books in the field of national security and terrorism, including Soldiers on the Home Front, The Domestic Role of the American Military, Harvard 2016 with Stephen Dicus. He currently serves as the chair of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Banks, for being here. And so just to break the ice, I thought it would be interesting to first discuss one of your many accomplishments besides, correct me if I'm wrong, over 160 book chapters, is also including your role on the Advisory Council for the Perpetual Peace Project. So I'm really curious to learn more about your role there, and more so if there was any inspiration here for your research in civil-military relations.
Right. So that's a very kind introduction. Thank you. And it's good to be with you today. In NATO, of course, the United States sticks out a bit. One, because we're on the other side of the Atlantic. Two, because we have a pretty fundamentally different structure for our government than other NATO countries. Not that all other NATO countries are alike, but I suppose the structural differences between our system and the other NATO countries are more pronounced. And I think for your subject area about the involvement of military in emergencies, particularly assisting civilians, those differences in our structure have a pretty significant impact on how we do things here and what the capabilities are. In my own background and research, I've always straddled the territory, if you will, between domestic and international issues and between US and international law. So the Kant Project, Perpetual Peace, for example, we were looking for modern applications of Kant's theories of justice and peace, and finding peace in an international environment and trying to transpose them to the contemporary environment. And it was a lot of fun. It was very interesting. We developed some good papers and gave some talks. And then since then, I've done a number of other projects involving European partners. I'm on the board of the INSCT in The Hague, which is not far from where you are now. And I've also just last couple of years completed a comparative project on civil-military relations with the German organizers. The German Bar Association published a book in German, except for my paper, which of course was in English, on comparative civil-military relations. And that volume may be of some interest to you as you go forward in your work, because there were contributors from the UK and from Ireland, from France, from Germany, 2 or 3 other countries that participated in that project.
And that's really interesting when you say a comparative study between Germany and the US, because I think one of our questions we've been really trying to dig into is how the cultural context of each country and the history plays a role into how reluctant or non-reluctant a country is to deploy. So I'm curious, did you do quite a lot of work on comparing the German attitude versus the American attitude?
Not so much. The way they structured the project was they asked each of us to talk about our system, and then the live event, the workshop that went on, allowed the authors of the various book chapters to compare. And the comparisons came out that way. I was looking at on my shelf over here, if I could show you the jacket of the book. Let's see.
Thank you. That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, here it is. I don't know, how's your German?
I would say I'm actually in Amsterdam right now, and I would say it's as bad as my Dutch, which is very
Okay.
little.
All right. I can't do, I have none. So I see my chapter here, it's in English, but
Oh,
there might be one other one in English, but most of the papers are in German. But it was a good work. The publisher is M4CE, which is a popular German imprint, I think. And I believe this was published in, the workshop was in 2017. I believe this was published in 2018. Yes.
ah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll
Sure.
definitely look into that. Now I would love to dive in a little bit to talk more about your 2016, The Soldiers on the Home Front. So I was reading a review and it says it's the first book to systematically analyze the domestic role of the military as it is shaped by law, surveying America's history of judicial decisions, constitutional provisions, statutes, regulations, military orders, and martial law to ask what we must learn and do before the next crisis. So I was actually really, I think this is so important to everything we're working on. So I think if you could maybe just provide for us, for the audience members who are listening, just a brief overview of maybe the journey on in your research. And then I would especially love to hear more about the legal and like framework and the history with that, because I think that's a missing puzzle piece in a lot of different countries.
Good, good. So yes, I'd be happy to. I think there are a couple of sort of fundamental truths, if you will, in the United States. One of them is that we value our military perhaps most among all our institutions. Americans love their military, and that there's a good reason for that. It's our largest institution. It's the institution, of course, which it was created to protect us all. And historically, over time, it has done a very good job at that. So that's sort of on the one hand. On the other hand, we also know that if not carefully controlled by civilian mechanisms and civilian control, that military authority may be abused, and it may be abused here domestically as well as it can during times of conflict. I understand your project is not focused on conflict settings, but on other settings. And by and large, the book that you're talking about, the Harvard book, was also not focused on conflict settings, but on others. We're not talking about war, in other words, or armed conflict. We're talking about domestic uses, which involve civil disturbances, natural disasters, policing issues, and the like. So structurally in the United States, again, in contrast to many NATO countries, we have a civilian commander-in-chief, the President of the United States. That's the way we sort of figured out how to rebel from King George back in the day. Because of the heavy-handed English approach to controlling the Americans over here in the colonies, we wanted nothing to do with a system where the executive was royal. So we walked very far away from that, and instead we tried in the early years to have a government without an executive. That failed miserably. Those were the Articles of Confederation. But when we came together in Philadelphia to form a constitution in 1789, the delegates recognized that we needed a single executive to make the government work, to exert some leadership, to have important centralizing control, to regulate a national economy, and so on. But at the same time, the importance of the single civilian executive was that he or she could be the commander-in-chief of the military when called into the actual service of the United States. So we have civilian control of the military. Domestically, this is where the Harvard book picks up. One of the themes that has been pervasive for now 230 years is that we try to keep our military out of civilian law enforcement activities. We have a very strict separation between the military and the police. They may both wear uniforms, they may both on occasion carry weapons, They may both follow, strict regimens about organizing and discipline and all the rest, but their activities are very carefully separated. So there's a funny Latin term for a law in the United States. It's called posse comitatus. Posse comitatus is a law that was enacted in the United States, which establishes a presumption that members of the United States military should not engage in civilian law enforcement. Seems to me that has pretty important ramifications for the settings that your project is focused on. Because while the personnel may be hugely helpful in responding to a disaster, a fire, a flood, a storm, other things, they can do so only up to the point where they're not engaged in enforcing the laws. So they can deliver medical equipment, they can transport people, they can put out fires, put sandbags in the event of flooding and so on, but they can't control people. They can't enforce a curfew or an area restriction, or certainly not make any arrests or engage in searches or surveillance activities. That's a sort of a very basic description of the line we have in the US between policing and military activities. And I dare say, over the years, that's presented some tensions in the US in how we go about emergency response.
And I'm curious too. It's so interesting that you said the line between the policing and military response. So, do you also did your work happen to study this in an international context as well, and the implications for the U.S. military abroad?
To some degree, yes. The German project, we of course talked about that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and I've done some other writing over the years, doing a little comparative work in Colombia, a little comparative work in Argentina, and in Israel, actually. But by and large, the focus, like the Harvard book, was on the domestic situation. I do think the lessons are portable. That is, how you can share civilian and military expertise in responding to serious crises. And as you know, from having worked on your background paper, the U.S. has done quite a lot to try to marry the civilian and military responses in crisis situations. You mentioned the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. There are a lot of other entities in our government that try to work coordinating mechanisms between civilian and military response.
And I know your book as well mentions some best practices. I was wondering if you might be able to share maybe one or two that might come to mind.
One of the most vexing problems in the US, I think this is true in other countries as well, is so-called chain of command. Who's in charge? So, as you know, when the military are trained and getting ready for their service, whatever it is, they adhere to a very strict military chain of command, from this level to this level to this level to this level, and it's very regimented. When civilian entities are involved in responding to a crisis where military forces are there as well, who do the soldiers report to? Do they report to their superiors, or do they take direction from a civilian supervisor? Can that difference be managed in a way that is productive? I think we've made considerable headway. The concept in the US, it's probably the same concept in Europe, is unified command. Can we strike a unified command, which would bring the civilian and military chains of command under one roof, if you will? That's one of the big things. Another thing is what in the United States we often refer to as the military's training and orientation. When a soldier signs up for the Army or the Navy or the Air Force and Marines, In the big picture, they're usually signing up to fight wars. That's unfortunate, but that's our history. That's the way the military's public relations, if you will, has always been oriented. And so when they're trained to fight, they're trained to defend themselves. When they're asked to respond to a fire or a flood or a pandemic, all of that training has to be replaced by something that's much more people focused, and it's very different. So that's been a historic rub. I think we've come quite a ways. I think in many years ago, the thinking was that military commanders, didn't even want to hear about a non-combat assignment because they didn't know what to do. That's for other people. That's for the Red Cross. That's for the city and county, departments of health, or the fire brigade, or the police, not the military. I think that attitude is very diminished now. I think military units all across the United States are very well versed in otherwise what we would have thought of as civilian response activities. There's one other thing. As you may know, we have a federal system in the United States, so government authority is divided between the national government and the states, and every state has its own military in effect, which we call in modern terms the National Guard. That's what the early Americans called the militia. The modern militia are the National Guards. There are National Guards in all 50 states. And so they wear uniforms and can look indistinguishable from a member of the United States Army or Marines and so forth. But they have a different status, and they're in the default position. They are subject to control by their governors of the state, not by the President of the United States. So many events, if there's a flood in New York State, for example, typically if military force is needed, say, to provide relief to those who are victimized by the flood, it'll come forward from the governor on the basis of state organization and control. And it's a little easier, frankly, for those units to coordinate with civilian authorities in response operations than if it was the federal military. So that complicates the picture a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. And I think, would you argue then that the federal authority versus the state authority, does that impact or impede the effectiveness of civil military coordination?
It complicates it, I think, is the best way to describe it. It's a puzzle that can be solved, and we've solved it in many ways, but there are infamous examples of where we failed to solve it. For example, in the summer of 2020, President Trump calling out the National Guard to come to Lafayette Square when he was having a photo opportunity. It was a hellish situation. The civil rights demonstrations in response to the killing of George Floyd and others around the United States. As an American, you know about those episodes where coordination between federal, state, and local was not well performed. And a lot of it was because the issues were so politicized.
No, that's exactly right. I think, you start to think about the Portland riots or even the Capitol riots. And I think, like you said, it blurs a lot of, it just, I think the verb you use, it complicates things, to say the least.
One of the mechanisms that we've had in the US for a long time to try to better organize response to emergencies, crises in the states that are not conflict related is called EMAC, EMAC, Emergency Management Assistance Compact. I don't know if you've come across that, but it's a pretty important structural device in the US. It basically provides for the nationwide National Guard, in other words, the military forces that are in the states, to share resources, to work with each other. So Hurricane Katrina, in Louisiana in 2005. EMAC responded to that, and National Guard forces from, I don't know, 15 or 20 different states, more than that eventually, converged on Louisiana to provide response support. And that's all done through a central coordinating mechanism called this EMAC. It's compact. A compact in the US is simply a fancy legal term for an agreement. It's like a contract. But our Constitution contemplates compacts, so we have them.
And I'm curious too, just in terms, since you're working in constitutional law, do you think the Constitution itself supports, say, for example, military deployment for the COVID-19 response? Do you think that we have the current legal framework to support this type of deployment that we're seeing?
For the most part, the answer is yes. But there are a number of us who work. I've been working actively on these issues in the U.S., particularly because of the threats to the structure that were posed during the Trump administration, to shore up the laws to make sure that they're not abused for political reasons, as they were or nearly were in some circumstances in the last administration. But by and large, I think the structure is pretty good. There's one of the big exceptions is that the District of Columbia, DC, that they're not treated like all the other states in the regulation of the National Guard. In effect, the president is the commander of the DC Guard. He shouldn't be. It should be the mayor of the District of Columbia of Washington, DC. She was left out. She was circumvented during those events a couple of years ago. But I'd say 98% of it is in pretty solid shape.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I think coming to our conclusions now, I just have a few more questions in terms of, firstly, I wanted to ask you, in your personal opinion, do you think the use of military assets should be more normalized and streamlined into disaster management? And if so, what trends would you hope to see in the years ahead?
And the answer is yes, because the military is the best resourced and most highly trained and most numerous resource that any of us have. That's true in European countries as well as it is here. So I think we have to take advantage. And that's one fact. Second fact is that emergencies are becoming more common and more costly. It's only the facts demonstrate the frequency of disasters and crises of one type or another is increasing, unfortunately, and they're becoming more expensive. So we have to marshal our resources. We have to get them from where we can. So I think there are hopeful signs that that well-intentioned military and civilian leadership understand that phenomenon and are working very hard to make it more seamless, better integrated, better sharing. There are a lot of stress points and frictions, but I'd say in general, that work is coming along pretty well.
And my last question for you is, do you have any upcoming publications on this issue soon, or what should we at this think tank be watching or waiting for you up ahead, since you're at the forefront of this topic?
I think I mentioned, or you mentioned maybe in my introduction, that I'm chair of an American Bar Association committee on law and national security. And that committee is now working on an emergency response project. And we're trying to eventually come up with a report that analyzes a basic question: who's in charge? Who's in charge when all hell breaks loose? Who should respond to the crises? And it's a domestic project, so we're only looking at the US. And it's a very challenging thing. We're looking at case studies, different kinds of crises. We're looking at the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack first. Then we're going to pick another one, and then another one, and then we're going to try to generalize and come up with a report. So it's going to be some time out. We're all volunteers who are working on this project. and we're all busy people with other things to do, but it's a very smart group of people, all law trained. So that may be a check against us, but we're doing the best we can with our limited legal lens.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I think your contributions and just hearing you, especially with your legal framework and being able to have that perspective, I think really brings in a fresh perspective and something we've been looking for as well. Just to, I think, like we said, it's almost a puzzle that you're trying to connect the dots. And
That's right.
yeah, we really, really appreciate your time.